Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm John Ciorciari, Director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, and very pleased to welcome you to an all-star panel of former U.S. ambassadors joining us from the American Academy of Diplomacy to talk about what's next for U.S. foreign policy after a momentous election. With all of the tribulations that have occurred this year, we're looking forward to 2021 and what that will bring for U.S. foreign policy. And I'd like to begin by introducing the four distinguished members of our panel. I'll start with Ambassador Dawn Liberi. She has 20 years of experience with the U.S. Agency for International Development, including service as USAID Mission Director in Uganda, in Nigeria, and in Iraq, as a Senior Development Advisor to the U.S. Commander at Central Command, as a coordinator of complex aid programs in Afghanistan and Libya, and most recently as the United States Ambassador to Burundi. I'd next like to welcome Ambassador Hugo Llorens, who has more than 3 decades of diplomatic experience. Among other roles, he served as the Director for Andean Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council, as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassies in Argentina and in Spain, and as Ambassador to Honduras. He later served as Assistant Chief of Mission and Special Chargé d'Affaires in Afghanistan. Thirdly, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Ambassador to South Korea, and later in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Most recently, he became the first American to hold the position of Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And last but not least, President of the American Academy of Diplomacy and our moderator for today's event, Ambassador Ron Neumann. He also has a long and distinguished diplomatic career, having served 3 times as ambassador, first to Algeria, then to Bahrain, and later to Afghanistan, and also has served in important roles in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and then as the U.S. Embassy liaison to the multinational command in that country. And so I'd like to welcome you all to the Ford School and the Weiser Diplomacy Center, and I'll turn over now to Ambassador Neumann, who will moderate today's conversation.
Well, John, Professor Ray, sorry, I'm always butchering your name, I apologize. It's really good to be back with you. As I said, with your smaller group of students this morning, I wish we could be there in person, but we're happy to be back with you in any form, and we've enjoyed it, and we will enjoy this, I'm sure. I have a great deal of experience here with my colleagues, and if somebody has the audacity to get out of Europe, Latin America, and Africa, I'm the backup for the Middle East. But what I'm going to ask my 3 colleagues to do to start off with, starting with Ambassador Liberi, then moving to Ambassador Vershbow, and then Ambassador Llorens, is to just to start us off, frame 2 or 3 of the big issues you see coming up in your region. And I recognize that this requires a great deal of simplicity. I know our Africanists always get particularly irritated because they have the biggest continent when people try to lump 50 odd countries and say, tell me about Africa. But having admitted that, I'm now going to ask Ambassador Liberi to, in a sense, do just that. There's a multitude of issues that each one of us could pick out for our area. But to get us started, Dawn, if you would start by framing 2 or 3 of the major challenges coming out of Africa that you see a new Biden administration having to start with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here. Very briefly, let me just say, I think that some of the key issues that we'll have to focus on in sub-Saharan Africa, first and foremost, will be ongoing conflicts. We've seen that right now with the Ethiopia Tigray issue. I think that there will be some more coming out of Western Sahara with the Polisario. And then there will also be an increase in jihadist groups and non-state actors. And I think this is something to keep our eye on, particularly in Nigeria and also in the Latako-Gorma region in West Africa. The second key issue is going to be elections. Burkina Faso just had elections, and although the previous president was reelected, I think that there may be some issues in terms of the opposition. In January, Uganda is going to have elections, and then in the rest of the year, there will be at least 6 or 7 other sub-Saharan African countries having elections, and I think that's an issue that we'll need to be watching. There is also the great power proxy issue in terms of China, Russia, and the US in sub-Saharan Africa. We can talk more about that in great detail later. And then finally, I would just ask everyone to keep an eye on the demographic wave that is coming in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2050, the continent will be 2.5 billion people. More than half the continent will be under the age of 25. And so there are significant challenges looming in terms of infrastructure, health, job creation, economic development, but also humanitarian issues and potential for a lot more conflict as well. Let me leave it at there, and we can get into more detail later.
Okay, great. Sandy, as you look out on a region spanning from Vladivostok to Portugal, pick out at least a few of the big issues that you think the Biden administration is going to have to deal with.
Okay. Well, first, it's quite obvious that our European allies are greatly relieved by the outcome of the election. The president-elect is a well-known figure in transatlantic relations, a believer in alliances and a friend of NATO and the European Union. So they're very keen on seeing a restoration of U.S. leadership. But they also recognize that we're not just going to rewind back to 2016 and pick up where we left off. The world has changed. The threats have changed. And at the same time, they also know that the United States is going to be oriented internally a lot more. So I think the first challenge I think the administration will need to tackle is how to reform and adapt NATO and the transatlantic relationship after several years of rancor and division and tantrums and bullying by President Trump. The institutions have endured all this, and so we're not starting from scratch. But I think that first challenge is to carry out a fundamental review of NATO's strategy, particularly since the new threat number one for NATO is now a rising China. Russia is still there as the most immediate threat, but the alliance needs to figure out how it's going to adapt to this era of great power competition with China as the number one threat. I think within that framework, actually defining a transatlantic approach to China is maybe the second challenge. There are economic dimensions to this. And again, trying to do America first has only played into the Chinese hands. I think coming up with a unified transatlantic approach to trade and to some of the global challenges, and trying to avoid an all-out confrontation with China by presenting a united front and getting them to continue to play by the rules rather than write their own rules. As I said, Russia is still the most immediate threat, and I think the third issue I would mention is the need for a more dynamic approach to Russia. We kind of defended ourselves after they invaded Ukraine in 2014, built up our own deterrence. We've tried to bolster the security of Ukraine, of Georgia, and other countries that the Russians have threatened in recent years. But I think we need to get off the defensive and be more proactive. And I think the new administration is laying out a kind of more robust policy, both of pushing back on Russian aggression, but also negotiating more aggressively, including on arms control, so that we can at least stabilize the relationship and hopefully convince Mr. Putin that it's better to start engaging and cooperating rather than pursuing a kind of zero-sum confrontation with the West. So those are just three issues. There are a lot of other problems that will need to be tackled, including the increasingly obstreperous Turkey. Western Balkans are still unstable. We have democratic backsliding in Hungary and in Poland. What to do about Iran and the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. All these things we'll have to engage with the Europeans on, even as we try to get out from the pandemic and the economic depression that we're still in.
Yep, the world is a complex and interrelated place. I'm going to pass to Ambassador Llorens now. And Hugo, as you look south all the way down to the tip of another continent, what do you see if you're talking to the Biden administration? And they've got lots of different places they can look. Where do they need to start?
Well, I look at the hemisphere very much as very close to home. It's very difficult for the United States to successfully project power across the Atlantic and the Pacific if we're not managing relations with our closest neighbors. So, the problem we've had in the last 4 years is that the Trump administration has largely ignored the region. Yes, migration has been a big focus for the president. He was able, to his credit, to achieve the U.S.-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement, which was a plus-up of the NAFTA agreement, and certainly deserves some credit. But largely, the president has been absent. And if you look at the polling, I mean, the U.S. standing in Latin America and in Canada, is at record lows. Both at the popular level, but also the political classes in the region have really lost a lot of confidence in Washington. So I think, I would also mention that the region was already in trouble economically prior to COVID. But with COVID, it's been a devastating shock. The estimates are that Latin American GDP will decline 9%, poverty rates are up 20%. And these are very poor countries. So they're facing a very difficult economic situation. So I would say probably the first priority would be for the United States to demonstrate its interest in the region and to reassert leadership. First issue would be COVID. The United States has been a traditional leader on health issues in the region, in Latin America, in cooperation with Canada. And I think it's critical that President Biden early on send a message of cooperation with the region in terms of vaccines, in terms of getting, the antiviral medications into the region, and again, work with the Pan American Health Organization in developing a program over the next year and beyond in cooperation on COVID. The next issue that I think is critically important is just North America. President Trump, again, while he was able to get the free trade agreement or the plus up to NAFTA, the reality is that he has badly damaged relations with Canada and with Mexico. And I think it's very important very early on for President Biden to reach out to both Canada and Mexico, potentially have a mini summit in Washington with all three leaders. And again, look at the region, look at North America in a very holistic way, whether it's certainly trade and economics. Canada and Mexico are our two largest trading partners, but everything else, energy, the environment, law enforcement, drugs, we need to work with our closest neighbors. We share a 5,000-mile border with Canada and a 2,000-mile border with Mexico, and we must get that right. My final point would be Central America. The problems in Central America walk to the United States, as we all know. And whether we have President Trump or not, we need to deal with the whole problem of migration. And so I think, but I think President Biden has great experience on Central America, and he urgently needs to engage the isthmus, but particularly the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and develop a holistic plan of cooperation that deals with economics, with governance, with corruption, with counter drug, to be able to get these countries to stabilize. But all three countries are near failed states right now. And so it's a priority. Final point would be just Venezuela. The whole issue of the collapse of democracy in Venezuela will be an important issue.
Dawn, I'm going to come back to you with an Ethiopia question, if I may. This is one we have from some of our audience, which is, the question is, what should the U.S. do now and after the transition to stop Ethiopia's war in Tigray? But I'd also like to ask you to sort of frame this as, how much should the United States care, and what leverage does the United States actually have to carry out whatever might be desirable.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. I just have to say there was a bit of static on my end, so I didn't quite fully hear everything, but so I'll focus a bit on the Ethiopia-Tigray issue, and I think you mentioned what can happen as we move forward, and to put this in a larger context. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I also asked, to the extent you can do it easily, how much should the United States care? And assuming we should care, what tools do we actually have to work with? And particularly, how adequate are, people often make lists of things you can do or pressures. They often don't do the second half of the discussion, which is how adequate are these things likely to be for what you're trying to do? So if you could sort of relate that practical piece to the more glorious policy options.
Right. Well, here again, this is a conflict. While it's an internal conflict in Ethiopia, the potential for this to spill over into the region is very high. And so this is an area where the U.S. should definitely care. Obviously, given some of the geopolitical interests and the potential, as I said, for this becoming a regional issue. Already it's been projected that there will be, between 200,000 and 500,000 refugees that will go into Sudan, as it will spill over into Sudan as a result of this issue. So I think one thing that we can do as the U.S. obviously is to encourage continued dialogue between Prime Minister Abiy and the TPLF in terms of the Tigray People Liberations Front. But more importantly, I think we need to help work with some of the regional organizations, the African Union, the East African Commission, etc., to help them broker a regional peace and to ensure that this doesn't get out of control, out of hand. Now, as you said, how effective are these instruments going to be? To be frank, there has been mixed results in other conflicts in the past using some of the regional institutions. I know when I was ambassador in Burundi, we wish that the African Union and the EAC had taken a more proactive role in terms of trying to convince the then president, not to run for a third term. And there is often a reluctance to get into domestic politics. However, as things start to expand across the region, then obviously that is the role of regional institutions. We have a large bilateral program with Ethiopia. I think as the U.S., we can engage in direct bilateral conversations with the government to, again, help enable them to have a lasting peace agreement and to use the levers that we have in terms of our assistance program, to help the process of peace and that dialogue, be successful. These are not always as sharp in terms of the type of focus that we would like to have. So I think we have to be very realistic because we've seen this play out in other conflicts across the continent, many of which have been ongoing for a number of years. But I'm hoping that we can encourage the parties to continue dialogue, stop fighting, and to try and contain the humanitarian issues that will undoubtedly result from this conflict if it continues to spiral. I think you're muted.
Sorry, we're having a little, trying to make sure we didn't get any background noise from the house. Passing over to Sandy, Ambassador Vershbow. I want to turn. We're getting. Is that feedback coming from me or elsewhere?
It sounds okay to me. Okay. Go ahead.
If I just echo in my own ears, I guess it doesn't matter. Turning to another ongoing conflict, and that is the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan. over Nagorno-Karabakh. And that is, the question that was asked was, can the U.S. help save Armenia? But I think you might also frame that in terms of, we have a domestic political issue here, both with Armenian America and with Turkic-speaking Armenians. We have the broader issues of Turkey and Iran and Russia. And so over to you, Sandy.
Well, I think in the near term, it's going to be very hard for the U.S. to save Armenia as much as we would want to, because I think the outgoing administration has basically practiced a policy of benign neglect that didn't look very benign when the shooting started. The Armenians, I have to say candidly, may have set the stage for this by basically slow rolling diplomatic efforts for years, convinced that they had military superiority over Azerbaijan and that they could withstand any effort by Azerbaijan to take back this the territory Nagorno-Karabakh, which is ethnically Armenian but part of Azerbaijan, and some of the other areas of Azerbaijan that they occupied, that the Armenians could always push them back. They didn't count on the fact that Azerbaijan has modernized its military with a little help from Israel and Turkey, and this time around had active support when they launched the war this fall. And Armenia found out that their Russian backers were not ready to step in. So the Russians basically were watching the Armenians go down to defeat until the very last minute when they brokered or imposed, I would say, a peace deal, which allows Russia to put peacekeepers on the ground, which will protect Nagorno-Karabakh, but otherwise leaves Armenia in a very weak situation. And the U.S., which is supposed to be an official co-mediator of this conflict, along with France, was completely bypassed. So we need to figure out how to get back in the game and ensure that this deal doesn't end up leaving Armenia, permanently dependent on Russia. And at the same time, we have to add this to the list of the many difficult issues we need to address with Turkey. There may be opportunities. Russia is getting more and more overextended in some of these adventures in its periphery, so-called near abroad. I think we can bring more to the table when it comes to helping Armenia with attracting foreign investment and other steps to reform their economy and their institutions. But at the moment, the Armenians are very much in the pocket of the Russians, and it's going to take a lot of effort for the U.S. to get back in the game. So I think the Biden administration will be inclined to do that, but it's not going to be easy.
Yes, you spoke about the Russians being overextended, but we certainly have more than enough issues to try to keep track of at one time. I can well imagine us having a problem of keeping focus if we launch into all these things.
It's true. Putin has played a weak hand very skillfully in a lot of places, and this is the latest on the list.
Yep. We've sometimes played a strong hand weakly. I've got a question now. The question is for Hugo, and I'll read it the way it's come in, but it goes to a broader theme as well. It says, if a similar situation to the 2009 coup happens in a Latin American country, I'm assuming they're thinking the Egyptian coup, but maybe another, should the incoming administration prioritize anti-corruption and rule of law over other U.S. interests and ultimately accept a coup, or should it push back harder than what was done in 2009? Unless was there a Latin American coup in 2009? Otherwise, okay.
Correct.
Where my focus is, where I think you're going to need to give the broader audience a little more background, because I wasn't sure of which coup it was.
Yes, I unfortunately was the ambassador in Honduras when we had the coup on June 28, 2009. And, obviously, the United States has had a very consistent policy of supporting democracy in Latin America, certainly since the Carter administration. It was continued by Reagan and on through when I arrived in Honduras in September of 2008. I was George W. Bush's ambassador, and then when President Obama came in, I was his. And Honduras was in crisis because we had a President Zelaya, who was a very complicated and difficult man. And he was certainly pushing against the democratic institutions. By the way, not unlike what we've seen in the US in the last 4 years. He never really crossed the line, but he was there all the time against the media, against the elites, the oligarchy, very much a populist message. And he was, again, moving more and more over time in the direction of Hugo Chavez. But the reality was that despite the fact that to a significant degree, President Zelaya created conditions of political crisis in Honduras, the manner in which he was removed from office on June the 28th was something that was completely unacceptable to the United States. Essentially, the military came in at 4 o'clock in the morning, the president's house. They grabbed him in his pajamas, as things have always been done in Latin America. They got him on a plane and sent him on a one-way trip to Costa Rica. Again, there are a number of reasons why that happened. Why, in a way, the U.S. lost control, because we were intimately engaged we have a lot of influence in Honduras. The U.S. ambassador is a very influential player, and that you'll have to almost wait for my novel for that. But the reality is that the administration, and I'm very confident whether it would have been President Bush, who I worked for in the National Security Council, as was the case with President Obama, immediately opposed the coup. It was clearly a coup. So, this idea that somehow the United States winked at this, not at all. The U.S. maintained a consistent policy of support for democracy, support for restoration of the constitutional order. And that was my job. I was the only ambassador remaining in Honduras. Everyone else pulled out, and Secretary Clinton asked me to stay with the express purpose of making sure we had elections and we had constitutional order restored. So I'm actually very proud, again, Republican and Democrat, in terms of our approach towards Honduras, which is a very complicated situation. I would never advocate that the United States, not support democracy in Latin America. I mean, with all the problems of Latin American democracies and the corruption and the dysfunctionality, as long as you have political freedom, you have a chance, and the region will make progress. Maybe not fast enough, but it will do so. So if at any point in time we resort to where we were before, again, the United States has a history, a negative history in Latin America. I mean, we winked at the coup when Batista took power in Cuba in 1952. The end result is Fidel Castro. Castro's is still there today. We overthrew the Guatemalan government, the Arbenz government, which was not really a communist government. We were involved in the Pinochet coup. So we have a past, but we've come a long way, and we should never go back to anything but supporting strong democratic institutions in Latin America.
Thank you. Because we faced something similar, and I apologize for my earlier ignorance. We certainly faced something similar when we had the coup in Egypt, particularly because our law, as I understand it, if we have a coup, requires us to basically cut off all of our aid. And that's an interesting kind of question when you have a situation like Egypt, where the Suez Canal is a major player in the U.S. economic welfare. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty has kept peace for 30 years in the Middle East. It gets a little tough to say you're going to drop kick all your other interests and just follow the law. And of course, in that case, we didn't. We tied ourselves into a verbal pretzel in order not to call it a coup. So I think we may have some problems with this going forward. in some other countries before we're done. I want to turn now back to Ambassador Liberi, to Dawn, and have a question that really goes back to your roots in AID here. And it said, how does a transition in foreign policy seep into USAID? And what will or could this look like, I suppose, looking forward to a Biden administration?
All right, thanks very much. Well, in different iterations, our policies, obviously, in terms of development, have changed as administrations have changed. One thing that has been constant in terms of the changing policy, depending on administration, has been the Mexico City policy since President Reagan, and that reflected more U.S. domestic policy about whether or not a president signed the Mexico City policy as an executive order into play. Usually happened within the first week, if not the first day of a new administration. So that's one area where U.S. foreign assistance, particularly in terms of reproductive health, was tied very closely to changing policy as a new administration came in. So typically, Republican administrations would administer the policy and sign it into order. Democratic administrations would undo the executive order. And USAID had to then pivot with each change in administration in terms of how we implemented or didn't implement the Mexico City policy program. And so that led to a lot of dancing, as you can imagine, as we dealt with our colleagues overseas. And it was a real institutional, change for folks. It's not that easy to keep staff on, to have them change their programs, et cetera, depending on the vagaries of Washington and the vagaries in terms of funding different programs. So I would highlight that as something that I think many people do know about as an area where development assistance was positioned upon a change in administration. That's probably the most significant. I think that, what we've had now under the Trump administration, we've had a new enactment in terms of sub-Saharan Africa of the BUILD Act, which is focused on pulling together and essentially merging OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, with certain elements of USAID. And that is meant to enable more flexible investment overseas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but not solely in Africa. It's a worldwide program, and it actually even has some domestic assistance tied to it as well. So these are two sort of examples of how foreign policy can change what we do on the development front. And finally, the last thing is, a very recent example is World Health Organization. Obviously, the Trump administration has said they want to pull out, have pulled out of it. Everyone is assuming that the Biden administration will change that again when President-elect Biden comes into office. But here is a very significant institutional relationship that the United States has had for 50 plus years. We are the largest donor. World Health Organization depends on us to continue its programs overseas. And that's perhaps one of the most dramatic recent examples of the kind of assistance changing depending on administration.
Thanks, Dawn. We got everybody back. Okay, I thought we lost somebody for a minute. I want to shift focus a little bit. First of all, let me remind the audience that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I've got one that I want to pose to each of our panelists, and that is how you think the executive congressional relations are going to work in foreign policy. How much support's the Biden administration going to have? if you can guess, or where is it going to run into problems? And I recognize that question is going to be very different depending on how the Georgia runoff goes and whether we have a Republican or a Democratic Senate. But for purposes of the question, and so we don't do too much on the one hand and on the other hand that drives people crazy when they want diplomats to answer questions, let's assume we have a Republican Congress, a Republican Senate, since we can basically figure that it'll be a little easier if it's Democratic. So I'm going to let Hugo, maybe if you would start, and just a couple minutes from each of you on how you think the relations, how free will the Biden administration be to conduct policy? Where will it run into roadblocks? I might add a couple of comments at the end of that on the Iran question too.
Great. Look, I'm not a great expert on Congress in Washington, but I would say that it'll be complicated. We live in a country that's very polarized. It's more polarized than any time in my professional life, and it's going to be reflected on the Hill. The Republicans control the Senate. They're going to make life difficult for the Biden administration in executing its foreign policy. Having said that, I believe that in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, people like Secretary of State designate Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are people who are respected on the Hill. They know the players. They all know each other, and despite the political bluster, there is respect. So my hope is that again, the president, as a former senator, President Biden, will be able to establish a working relationship with the Senate on what are the really core strategic issues for the United States. I don't think he'll find opposition on some of the issues like, strengthening our alliances with the Europeans, countering, and Sandy can talk about this, but countering Russia, in Eastern Europe, supporting democracy in Latin America. Dealing with China, I think there'll be a lot of commonality. There's been a shift in the American public opinion on China. There's kind of an opportunity for a consensus on China, but one that is kind of rational and sustainable. So it'll be difficult, but I still have faith that President Biden and his very able national security team will be able to establish, a modicum of working relations.
Sandy,
should I go next?
Issues where the administration will find support in Congress, particularly Republican issues, will be under attack, perhaps from some progressives, if we're not shoving hard enough on some of the humanitarian and other issues.
Yeah, well, I think that on most issues there will be sufficient bipartisan support for the administration to carry out its policy without any pushback or interference from Congress, particularly on, as Hugo said, on how to deal with an aggressive Russia, the need to prioritize China. I think there'll actually be support for a somewhat more nuanced approach to China than the Trump administration has pursued. Yes, stand up to them, don't let them attack Taiwan, but try to find some kind of common ground on trade through revitalization of the World Trade Organization, things like that. I think there may be some specific exceptions. Turkey's a sensitive issue in the Congress, and the fact that they're buying Russian air defense systems makes them subject to sanctions, which the Trump administration has delayed and delayed. I think the Congress may really squeeze the new administration to deliver on that, which could lead to a downward spiral in relations with Turkey. Iran and what to do with the nuclear deal. Remember that there were many Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, who opposed the JCPOA. And so the administration's desire to kind of find a way back into that agreement or to augment the agreement to address some of its weak points may encounter resistance from the Congress. And Hugo knows more about this than I do, but I think trying to return to the Obama rapprochement with Cuba, that may run into a buzzsaw, as has almost always been the case in the past. And we saw the implications of that in the voting in the state of Florida among the Hispanic population. So I think there'll be specific issues that are contentious. Oh, one other thing I would mention is arms control. There's the New START treaty with Russia got ratified by a whisker back in the good old days when we were still in the middle of the reset with Russia. I think there's going to be a lot of skepticism of any new treaty that the Biden administration may deliver. The simple solution is to extend the existing treaty for a few more years, which can be done without congressional approval. But even that could lead to some backlash and hostage taking within the defense budget if Biden doesn't play it very carefully with the Congress.
Dawn, is Congress paying attention to Africa? How do you see those issues playing out there?
Sorry, Ron, were you speaking to me? There was a terrible echo. I couldn't hear.
Sorry, Dawn, putting the same question to you, but in the African context of how you see the Congress, possibly Republican Senate, Democratic House, interacting with the Biden administration for better or worse.
Right. Well, let me just say, in general, particularly in the area of foreign assistance, there has been strong bipartisan support. In fact, what we've seen over the last 4 years is that the administration put forward budgets to significantly reduce the foreign assistance budget, including State Department, USAID, and that it was the Congress, with its strong bipartisan support, that actually put the levels back to what they had been under the Obama administration. And so this happened pretty much every year over the last 4 years. So I would say that that's shows and demonstrates the kind of bipartisan support that foreign assistance has. I think one key thing that will be coming up is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. While that has had strong bipartisan support, it's due for renewal in 2025, and I think that will come under some scrutiny from the Hill, from some of the Republicans as they look forward to see what the benefits have been under AGOA. And even though there have been a number of them, it possibly hasn't been as robust in some areas as some would like it to be. Much of the trade focuses particularly on petroleum exports from Africa to the United States. And there may be a feeling on the part of some that the U.S. isn't getting the type of reciprocal trade benefit in Africa. So that might get some scrutiny between now and when the AGOA is up for renewal. And I think in general, we'll be looking at other trade agreements in sub-Saharan Africa. The Trump administration had tried to start some free trade agreements with individual countries like Kenya. That didn't really get off the ground. So it will remain to be seen whether or not the upcoming Congress wants to do individual country type of agreements or continue with a broad-based regional approach. And I think that's where the Biden administration will have to engage in a fair amount of conversation with the Hill to see where that process will be going.
You know, I think one issue where you will see huge pulling and tugging with the Congress will be Biden's idea of trying to go back into the Iran nuclear deal. And this is one which is incredibly sensitive. It's been under attack by the Republicans. It's going to be it has all kinds of complications, of course. In fact, one is that to get something done, the Iranians are very much likely to want some guarantee that any new deal will be held to better than the old deal. The problem is, of course, that the only way you can pledge to actually hold to the deal is to make something into a treaty instead of an executive agreement. And the reason it was an executive agreement the first time was that the Obama administration didn't think it could get that passed as a treaty. So now you've got the conundrum that on the one hand, the Iranians are very likely to push, particularly if we want changes, for changes that are reciprocal in terms of the promises actually being kept. And we're going to have a harder problem than we had the first time. But, you know, it's an interesting thing. I just leave the students with the thought that this business of where are domestic politics in foreign policy is an age-old issue in the U.S. And I think often when one studies foreign policy, we look at this as a nasty distraction of those politicians who keep messing about with the good of the nation as foreseen by the wise leaders. And yet, you know, when I was reading Robert Zoellick's book on diplomacy, and he pointed out that when Jefferson was maneuvering to get the French to concede what turned out to be the Louisiana Purchase, he was using domestic politics and threatening war down the Mississippi with militias. The first GATT agreement had to overcome massive domestic sensitivities about wool tariffs. And in fact, when we went into the what became the Marshall Program, the Lend-Lease, opinion polls were showing 60% of Americans after World War II didn't want to be bothered with any of this stuff. It took a huge leadership role from President Truman to bring domestic politics in line with where he wanted to go, George Marshall and others. And of course, with Franklin Roosevelt bringing Arthur Vandenberg into the negotiations to set up the UN, was a major importance in getting the UN through and not failing the way the Versailles Treaty did. So I just thought it would be interesting to broaden that reflection a little bit, to remind people that one, domestic politics are always there. Two, that you can't sustain any important policy, as we've seen with Iran, without domestic support. And three, that it is often on the administration to build that domestic support rather than to only go where it can find it. I want to turn to something really quite different now. We had a number of questions about what it's like to be an ambassador and things like this. And one is this. I always find this a hard question to answer, but I'll see what my colleagues do. We'll go around the horn again. And that is, what has been the most useful skill to you as an ambassador? And I suppose the corollary of that would be, if you're talking to people who might think of becoming diplomats one of these days, what would you encourage them to learn? I'll even let you have a couple of points there. And let's see. I don't know if anybody particular who was up last. Let's let Hugo start again, if that's okay.
That's a good question. I would say that for me, the one consistent was, if you're going to be a diplomat, you got to like people. You have to be a people person. You have to have curiosity about foreign cultures, about people who are different from yourself. And that's been maybe the thread from when I entered the Foreign Service in A100 and did my first tour in the Philippines all the way to my last as a chief of mission in Afghanistan. You really have to feel, you got to like people. You have to be comfortable. You like to be exposed to different cultures. So that's the thing. Later, you can get very academic and sophisticated. And for me, at the end, I spent maybe close to 20 years of my career in senior management positions, either as an ambassador or as a deputy ambassador, what we call deputy chief of mission, or a principal officer. I was in our consulates in Vancouver and Sydney. And there, I will say that experience matters. I don't consider myself a particularly brilliant person, but when you learn over a long time, being out in the field, these things come back and you see them again. And so experience matters. And if you have, and with experience comes judgment. And I would say success or failure in our business at a senior level is really about, judgment.
That is right on. And when you talked about experience, Hugo, you reminded me that my favorite pet definition of experience is not having all your mistakes in front of you. And so we've all acquired now a lot of experience. Sandy, how would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I like Hugo's answer. For me, kind of the reason I wanted to become a diplomat and I persevered for close to 40 years was kind of to be involved in policy making. I very much enjoyed the overseas roles of developing relationships and reporting back and interpreting what different countries think about our country and trying to persuade them of our policy. But it was the work inside the policy machine, in both in Washington and in Brussels when I served at NATO at different times. So I think the most important thing there, I think, is ultimately is your sort of persuasiveness. And it brings me back to sort of the most basic thing that every Foreign Service officer needs to be able to do: write clearly, write in a succinct way that can convince the reader that you have ideas that are worth paying attention to. That goes hand in hand with creativity, a kind of facility for problem solving, a bit of readiness to take risks, to challenge conventional wisdom, to think outside the box, and not to worry that you're going to get slapped down for being crazy. And of course, as you would rise through the ranks, leadership, interpersonal skills, being able to create a team, motivate a team, develop the talent of other people, not hog the spotlight. Those are all sort of attributes that I think are important. And of course, listening. You have to persuade people. You also have to listen. Put yourself in the other guy or the other country's shoes and try to understand problems from their perspective and find ways to at least claim that there's common ground that could lead to a solution to a problem.
Thank you. Dawn, over to you. You're muted. Yep.
All right. Gary. Yes, these are great questions. And in addition to what my colleagues have said, I'll just add a few things. I think we all as Americans, and particularly as diplomats, have to be very, very open to knowing that other cultures see things from different perspectives, that we don't always have the right answer, and that, going hand in hand with listening is understanding and respecting that while others may have different answers, they are and can be equally as good as ours. And I think that's part of the process as we serve overseas, to recognize that nuances in other cultures, the way that people look at things, is a strength, it's an asset, and that it does bring something different in terms of U.S. decision making. And I think that's a great point of respect and also resiliency. I think it's very important for the diplomats to be patient, to be resilient, to understand that the process of engaging is as important as reaching some endpoint, because often an endpoint just is one sort of data point along the way. And as we're negotiating and trying to reach different points of diplomacy and different areas of agreement, that for many, that process, as I said, is as important in terms of our counterparts. I also think it's very important on our own teams to make sure that we are as inclusive as we can possibly be, listening to all of our staff. And here again, knowing that, part of the out-of-the-box thinking may come from individuals that you hadn't anticipated would have solutions to certain problems. And I think that's all part of team building and that leadership process as well. And this goes, from not just engaging cross-culturally, but I remember in one team building session, we had everyone participate, including our drivers, and everyone was a bit shocked about that. And it turned out that the drivers actually had some very good solutions to some issues that we were facing, particularly as we were trying to get into some conflict areas in the particular country. So again, that's just one example of some out-of-the-box thinking. So patience, resilience, being able to listen, and yes, being able to persuade, particularly from a policy perspective, but being very open to other points of view. I think those are key.
Thanks. You know, as I was listening to you all, I was thinking that there is sometimes this perception in Americans that diplomats go overseas and then they become too sympathetic to the foreigners. Why do you want to listen to those people? You know, you're out there to do our stuff. And I was thinking it might be worth just noting that, you know, the fundamental job, and you all know this, I'm just sort of talking to the audience, is to get other people to do what we want and to like it sufficiently that we can come back and get them to do the next thing we want rather than build up hostility. And so a lot of what my colleagues have been talking about in this business of listening is how you understand others well enough to shape the most effective approach to go where we want to go. It isn't it isn't really about listening to others in order to do what they want. It's listening to others to find out how to shape our own approach, or if we can't have everything we want, how to find the best compromise that is the most useful for our own needs. And so I just thought it was, maybe that's too basic, but I thought it was just a bit useful to give this larger context about why we need to listen, which is my lead characteristic. Now, switching to another focus, and we'll let everybody go around a couple of minutes on this one. I think we can carry on till about 5:15. And there is a question about rising nationalism. And this was one that came from Kate Randall. It's a big question. It's about how has the rise of nationalism around the globe, Brazil, UK, Poland, etc., affected diplomacy and cooperation? And has it become more challenging as right-wing politics have radicalized? And I don't think we have time enough. This is a seminar's worth of a question here. But, you know, maybe Sandy, if you could speak to this, particularly in the case of Hungary and Poland, and what that challenge of the popularism means for U.S. policy and for NATO. And Hugo, if you could pick, you know, Brazil, huge country, huge importance. Is this a problem? What do we need to do about it? Dawn, you got so many choices in Africa. I'm not sure how to specify one. I'll let you come last and pick wherever you think rising tide of nationalism is both worth exploring. But let me let Sandy go ahead and start this.
Yeah, it is becoming an increasing challenge within both NATO and within the European Union. Hungary and Poland have clearly been regressing in recent years in terms of their respect for the independence of the judiciary, which is the issue that's been challenged by the rest of the EU, because you have to meet a lot of standards to get into the EU. And by having two that are both breaking the rules, they can protect each other. The EU actually has some ability to sanction a particular rogue member, but if it requires a consensus -1, if you have -2, the rogues get away with it. And so they're now deadlocked on the EU threatening to take funding away that the EU countries are, usually guaranteed, and Hungary and Poland threatening to block the whole budget and kind of paralyze the European Union. So things are not as dire inside NATO, in part because both Poland and Hungary kind of generally live up to their obligations on defense and spend a lot of money. Poland is one of the leaders in terms of defense spending. But there is an increasing tendency for these countries to take hostages on things that are of secondary importance, but nevertheless block NATO functioning. For example, Hungary has held up any high-level meetings between NATO and Ukraine because of the irritation over what they consider to be discriminatory policies towards the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So this challenge, NATO has no mechanism to punish or ostracize a country that breaks the rules, and everything is based on consensus. And if a country is bloody-minded and wants to put its own national parochial interest ahead of the collective interest, it can get away with it. So this is something that NATO is going to have to reckon with if the trend towards more nationalistic governments continues. Turkey is another problem child inside NATO. Has done the same thing, suspending partnership activities with Israel, even with Austria, which you wouldn't think would be considered a troublemaker. So as NATO grows, has 30 members, it's going to be harder and harder to keep everybody in line. And that's why it's at least a good thing that you have a U.S. administration that wants to make NATO work rather than wants to run it down.
Sandy, as you look at the problems within NATO and the EU, do you see that they make individual policies difficult? Do you see them rising to the level where they threaten the organizations?
But if Poland and Hungary are joined by one or two more countries that want to kind of resist those established members who want to hold them to the founding norms of the organization, then there could be a paralysis. And it's at a time when we actually need the EU to be doing more in the world rather than less. I've felt we need to, in fact, get NATO and the EU to kind of form a kind of formal partnership if we're going to deal more effectively with China, with problems in the Middle East and North Africa. So something needs to be done to try to contain this abuse of consensus, which could lead to the paralysis of the institutions.
Hugo, turning south to Brazil.
Yeah, well, again, the Bolsonaro government has been a very rightist nationalist government, very populist. President Bolsonaro has maintained a very close relationship with President Trump. Bolsonaro has still not recognized President-elect Biden as the winner of the November 3rd election. So, that we're off to sort of it's going to be a complicated situation. What I would say, though, is I recall back in 2005, I was the deputy chief of mission in Argentina when we had the Summit of the Americas. President Bush came down, and President Bush's great dream was to launch the free trade area of the Americas. President Trump was a great believer in free trade, and he wanted to launch a hemispheric-wide free trade negotiations. Well, lo and behold, we get to Mar del Plata, and the Brazilians ultimately scuttled it. It was a left-wing government at that time. It was democratic, but it was left-wing, and they weren't going to buy into this free trade nonsense. And I remember a little side conversation hearing the president tell us, "Boy, it's going to be bad. This has been a failed summit, but Brazil is a country you can't just arm wrestle, And I thought, you can't just wrestle them to the ground. And I thought that was kind of something that always stayed in my mind. And I think the same thing with the situation today. We're going to have some issues with Brazil, the issue of climate change, the issue of protection of the Amazon. Certainly, Bolsonaro has not been someone who's been at the forefront of having, rational policies on COVID. So there are going to be issues. But on the other hand, Bolsonaro believes in trade, and he is negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. I mean, the United States, Brazil's our 10th largest trading partner. We have bilateral trade of $100 billion. American companies are invested in Brazil to the tune of several $100 billion. So we have a huge capital stock invested in the country. So I would say that we're going to go through a rough time, but we can't just arm wrestle Brazil to the ground. We're going to have to find a way to maintain a cooperative relationship with the great nation of South America. And I'm actually confident that once President Biden gets a feel for Bolsonaro, they'll find a way to go forward. It has to be. So I think there'll be some bumps in the road, but it certainly is manageable.
You know, Hugo, as you were talking, you remind me that one problem I often have seen, I'm sure you've seen it in the op-eds, the chattering class, is you will see people saying, well, the problem is you don't have your priorities in order, as though there were one set of priorities you could put in order and the second could always be sacrificed to, or should be, to the first. And you remind us, and there are so many other situations that we've all dealt with, where our problem often as diplomats or as policy people is to move multiple priorities to try to keep them from bumping into each other. You know, in particular situations, you weight one more than another, but it's not at all an issue of just having a priority order, but of managing not to have self-immolation as you try to pursue them. Dawn, this whole issue of rising nationalism in Africa, as applied to Africa, and how do you see that as a problem?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of ways that this is manifesting. I would say first and foremost, recently there has been a trend, certainly when I was ambassador in Burundi, the then President Nkurunziza wanted to run for a third term. This has been echoed by President Museveni in Uganda, wants to now be on his fourth term, President Kagame in Rwanda. So there's been an emphasis now on the part of a number of African leaders to just basically stay in office and to a certain extent, reject term limits and to reject the element of democracy and governance, and to say, well, our form of democracy and governance is different here in Africa. We don't necessarily have to have term limits. What we need is stability, economic development, etc. And so, you know, this has presented a challenge because obviously in a number of the countries, their own constitutions had been enacted with term limits. And then because of the respective presidents, they had huge movements to basically undo those constitutions, change them so that they could stay in place as incumbents, even if there was a veneer of elections. And so, you know, we faced a very difficult process of trying to, you know, focus on policies of term limits, at the same time, you know, handling the delicate issue of, well, do you want to just focus only on that element of democracy and governance, or do you want stability in the region, economic development, et cetera? Now, it's not that the two are mutually exclusive, but that was the way that it was and continues to be presented in a number of countries. There's another issue where we're seeing the rise, particularly in West Africa and Central Africa, and certain elements, it's sort of a band across the continent, of the rise of jihadism and non-state actors. And part of that is because the governments themselves are unable to provide the kinds of services that the population needs. There's growing discontent. Ron, this is something that you and I saw in parts of Afghanistan and Iraq, where, you know, the Taliban was a response to a number of Afghans, ISIS in certain places in Iraq. And so there's a similar model being portrayed in Africa, where non-state actors are gaining a lot of power and significance because they are promising an alternative to the central government. And in some places, this is being done through violence, like in Nigeria with Boko Haram, etc. But in some areas, like the Leptako Gorma region that borders Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, a number of the population are saying, well, maybe this is a better alternative. Maybe this is an answer to some of our problems. And we're so far from the capital and we don't get benefits from the capital that maybe this sort of regional dynamic is better for us. And I think that these are issues that we collectively are going to need to keep an eye on, because the potential for conflict, the potential for increased violence, humanitarian issues, is going to loom large, particularly as the demographic wave in sub-Saharan Africa continues at its current momentum to double the population within the next 25, 30 years. And there will be a significant number of jobless youth who will be disaffected and who will seek alternatives that currently don't exist. So I think this is a huge area of control that the United States and others will need to be looking at in the future.
Thanks, Dawn. We've got a lot of questions in the chat box, and I'm sorry we're not going to come anywhere close to reaching some of them because there's some really good questions there. But I'm going to pull one out for all of us for this last round, and I'm going to start with Sandy, give him a warning here. And the question came from Zachary Silkin. It says, when reaching such a senior position as ambassador, what were the aspects of the position that most surprised you? And I recognize the answer might be very situational depending on which country, or it could be general. But let me, and of course, all of us watched a lot of other people have this kind of job before we got it. So, Sandy, where were the surprises and where were not? And let you go, and I think I'll go back to Dawn and let Hugo sweep up here.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think I would say what surprised me was just how much any utterance by the American ambassador is kind of seized upon by the public, by the media. You got to be very careful, choose your words properly. This was my experience both in Russia, when I had plenty of opportunities. This was the early Putin days, to engage with the media and give speeches. It was kind of a much more open time. But I had to be careful not to get too much attention that would lead to either policy issues or a slap on the wrist from Washington for being a little too out in front. And the same applied in Korea, where there's very volatile situation. They're very pro-American, but also there's an undercurrent of anti-Americanism going back to the days of the dictators. So the American ambassador can be a kind of an imposing figure that is appearing when he says something, dictating to the Koreans what they should be doing. I found that using soft power was one way to kind of demystify the American ambassador. I'm a wannabe rock drummer, and I used to play with local bands, and that kind of gave me a bit of a human face, and I was seen as a less ominous figure than when I first arrived.
Thanks. Dawn, go ahead. Dawn, can you hear us? Oops, you're muted. There you go.
Ron, I'm not sure if you're speaking with me, but I'm sorry. It's such an echo. I can't.
Yes, your turn.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but I didn't even hear the question.
The
Just very
question,
quickly.
yeah. If you can see the chat box, it's the one almost at the bottom. It is, when reaching such a senior position as ambassador, what were the aspects of the position that most surprised you? Could you hear that okay?
Okay.
We seem to be losing Ambassador Liberi. I'll tell you what, let me.
Okay. Can
I can hear you.
I can.
I can hear you, but your picture's coming on and off. But it may be easier just to leave your picture off and see if that improves it. We may have lost Dawn. Hugo, let me let you go ahead and respond,
Well,
and we'll see if Dawn comes back.
I thought Sandy's
Okay.
question, the answer was a good one, but for me, it may sound arrogant, but I wasn't so surprised once I became an ambassador. I served 6 years as a DCM, where you're sort of the number two to an ambassador. So just working intimately with an ambassador, every single day. So there weren't that many surprises, but it related more to my own flaws. That sometimes you come in, you have strong views on issues, and this happened in Honduras and Afghanistan. And you may think you know more than everybody else. That's a big mistake, because if you come in with that idea and you're conveying that to your team, very quickly you can become isolated. No one will come in, and you'll be the loneliest man in the world sitting in your big office. So one of the things I always had to remind myself, this idea of, first of all, listening and in really encouraging people to give you their honest, unvarnished truth, their views. And again, it was something that maybe it's because of my own temperament, but I always had to remind myself. I think I got it right in the end, but if I wasn't careful, you can very easily become an isolated ambassador.
Dawn, are you back with us? I think we may have. Yep, there. Dawn, are you back with us? We're not hearing you. I think we may have to go ahead and close out here. One of the things that occurred to me, my first experience with seeing but not being an ambassador, because my father was ambassador to Afghanistan. And so the first experience I had of looking at a mission from the ambassador's eyes were when I visited him before I joined the Foreign Service, and got some of his reflections. And I remember him telling me that one of the biggest problems would be people in the embassy saying, why don't they, meaning the ambassador front office, do something about it, whatever the problem was. And he said, often the answer turns out to be because they don't know about it. And just trying to keep on top of your mission without being a spy is one of the perennially challenging positions. Dawn, are you back with us? I see you nodding so you can hear. No, we're not hearing you. You don't appear to be muted. No, I don't know, unless we get some technical help. Can't hear you. Well, don't worry. You had a lot of great interactions before this last one, and
Can you hear me now?
now I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, okay. I don't know what I did. I can't see anyone, but oh, here we are. Okay. Well, Ron, I think similarly to what you said, being ambassador, I found one of the things most interesting was that there was a disparity between what people thought I knew and didn't know, and the things that I knew that they didn't know that I knew. And because what I found is that many people are very willing to send information to the ambassador in different ways, particularly our counterparts on the outside, et cetera, et cetera. And I found that some of the best information I received and what was unfettered came from sources that I would not have anticipated. So for example, ungarnished sort of input from journalists or from the press, ungarnished input from non-governmental organizations, from regional leaders, governors, mayors, etc. And I found that many people were very, very willing to give me information in an unsolicited manner that actually helped my understanding of the situation. And because it hadn't gone through the chain of command and the authority sort of chain and gotten filtered along the way, it was actually very, very useful. And I was surprised at how much that happened, but how important that was as well. And I have to say that enabled me to understand certain situations and then to go back and ask my staff about situations where they were actually surprised that I had known about X, Y, or Z because it hadn't come from them. And I think that was one of the key lessons that I learned, that you really do need to be very open to sources of information, verify, don't just accept anything, but be very open to accepting different sources of input and not just going through the chain of command or the chain of authority.
It's a very good observation. In Bahrain, I used to sit out on a bench outside the embassy late in the afternoon and smoke a meditative pipe. And people found out that was a place where they could find the ambassador. And so people would just show up. Some were smokers, some were never going to be smokers, but it was a place where they could just drop in and have a chat. And it actually worked remarkably well. I think we have really run out of time. John, if you're there, I think we should pass back to you. Thank you for having us. I hope you and the students and others on the screen who aren't on the screen have enjoyed this. It's been a lot of fun, I think, for all of us.
Thank you. Fun for me too, and really appreciate this wealth of insights. You certainly have laid out for us an indication of what a broad and complex tapestry of foreign policy challenges the new administration will face, from Eastern Europe to Ethiopia, from the Northern Triangle to Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's a great advertisement for the need that our country has for experienced, expert diplomats like the four of you. Certainly, it'll be a priority for the administration to replenish the diminished ranks of senior folks in the State Department and elsewhere who carry out diplomacy. And we, as you know, on our end at the Ford School and Weiser Diplomacy Center, are in the business of trying to train tomorrow's leaders in foreign affairs. And for that, we're really grateful to have this partnership with you at the Academy of American Diplomacy. We look forward to continuing that partnership. Thanks again to the four of you, to the Academy, and to all of you in the audience for participating. Stay tuned for more events from the center coming up, and have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. We look